Mihai's warning. Alex awoke to the smell of damp earth and burning wax. His body ached, his head throbbed, and for several moments he couldn't place where he was. The room was bathed in a flickering orange light, the shadows of candle flames dancing across the rough stone walls. The oppressive chill was gone, replaced by a humid warmth that clung to his skin. He tried to sit up, but stopped as a sharp pain lanced through his temple. Gingerly, he touched his head and felt a thin line of dried blood near his hairline. His pulse quickened as the events of the night before flooded back. The footsteps, the whisper, the shadow advancing on him with its glowing red eyes and twisted, monstrous form. "Ah, you're awake," came a gravelly voice. Alex turned his head sharply, wincing at the pain, to see Mihai standing near the door. The old man leaned on his cane, his face partially obscured by the flickering shadows. In his other hand, he held a ceramic bowl filled with what looked like a steaming herbal concoction. What happened? Alex croaked. His throat was dry, and his voice came out hoarse. "You screamed," Mihai said simply, moving closer. "Then you fainted. I found you on the floor of your room, babbling nonsense." "Nonsense?" Alex frowned, pushing himself into a sitting position despite the dizziness. "There was something in my room, something that wasn't human." Mihai's pale eyes narrowed. He set the bowl on the table and leaned on his cane, his expression unreadable. "What did you see?" Alex hesitated, unsure whether he should trust the old man. But the memory of the shadow creature was too vivid, too horrifying to ignore. He recounted everything, from the footsteps in the hallway to the whisper behind him and the monstrous figure that had appeared out of the darkness. When he finished, Mihai was silent for a long moment, staring at Alex with an intensity that made him squirm. "You've seen it," Mihai said at last, his voice low. The Watcher and the castle's curse." Alex blinked. "The Watcher? What does that mean?" Mihai sighed heavily and sank into the wooden chair by the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked older in the candlelight, his face etched with deep lines of weariness. "This castle, it is more than just stone and mortar," Mihai began. "It is a wound, a scar on this land, carved by centuries of blood and suffering. The Watcher is its guardian, its jailer, and its prisoner. It is bound to the castle, just as the castle is bound to it." Alex shivered. "I don't understand. Bound how? What is it guarding?" Mihai leaned forward, resting his gnarled hands on the head of his cane. "You are a historian, yes? You came here for stories of Vlad Tepes, the Impaler. But Vlad was merely a man, a cruel, calculating man. Yes, but human nonetheless. The real darkness of this place lies deeper. It was here long before Vlad ever set foot in these halls." The old man's voice dropped to a near whisper. "This castle is a gateway, a threshold between our world and something else. And the Watcher ensures that nothing crosses that threshold without payment." "Payment?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. Mihai's gaze was unflinching. "Blood. Vlad the Impaler and the Blood Court." Mihai stood, his cane tapping against the stone floor as he moved toward the window. He stared out into the fog-shrouded courtyard, his back to Alex. "When Vlad came to power, he began. He was already a man consumed by fear. Fear of losing his throne, fear of betrayal, fear of death. He sought power wherever he could find it, in whatever form it took. It was here, in Bran Castle, that he made his pact with the Blood Court." Alex furrowed his brow. "The Blood Court? I've never heard of that." "Few have," Mihai replied. "It was a secret council, a group of mystics and scholars who dabbled in forbidden arts. They believed they could commune with the forces beyond this world, forces older than God or devil. They promised Vlad a way to secure his reign, to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies and ensure his name would live on for eternity." Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine, and he believed them. Mihai turned to face him, his expression grim. "Would you not? If you were a ruler surrounded by enemies, if your own kin plotted against you, would you not grasp at any chance to hold onto your power?" Alex didn't answer. "They performed their rituals here," Mihai continued, "in the bowels of the castle, beneath the chapel. They spilled blood on the altar, men, women, children, all sacrifices to the entity that now guards this place. Vlad became more than a man after that. Some say he became invincible, that no blade could touch him. But the price? Mihai trailed off, shaking his head. What was the price? Alex pressed. The Watcher, Mihai said simply. The castle's curse. The Blood Court thought they could control the entity, but they were wrong. It consumed them, one by one, until only Vlad remained. And even he was not spared. His madness grew. His cruelty became legend, and his soul, well, perhaps it still lingers here, alongside the Watcher. Villagers' disappearances. Alex leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. And the villagers? What about them? Mihai's expression darkened. They were the first to notice the changes after Vlad's pact. Their animals began to disappear. Then their children. They would hear screams in the night, see lights flickering in the forest, and find the ground soaked with blood in the morning. The old man lowered his voice, his eyes flickering toward the shadows as if afraid they might overhear. Even after Vlad was gone, the disappearances continued. Some say the Watcher requires a steady supply of offerings to stay bound to the castle. Others believe it feeds on the fear of those who live in its shadow. Does it kill people? Alex asked hesitantly. Mihai's laugh was humorless. Kill? No. Death would be a mercy. The Watcher takes what it wants. Those it touches are never seen again. Not in any form we would recognize, at least. A final warning. Alex felt a wave of nausea. Why would anyone stay here? Why haven't they abandoned the village? Mihai shrugged. The land is all they know. And some believe that as long as the castle has its sacrifices, it will not take more than it needs. But you, he pointed a gnarled finger at Alex. You don't belong here. You've upset the balance just by setting foot in this place. Alex bristled. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came to learn, to uncover the truth. The truth. Mihai snapped, his voice rising. The truth is that this castle is a tomb, a wound, and a prison all at once. Those who dig too deep into its secrets never leave the same. If they leave at all. Alex stood, his frustration boiling over. I'm not leaving, Mihai. I've come too far to turn back now. The old man sighed, his shoulders slumping. Then I hope you're prepared, scholar, because the castle will take what it wants, and it always wants something. With that, Mihai turned and shuffled toward the door. As he reached it, he paused and glanced back at Alex. Keep your door locked tonight, he said softly, and pray that the Watcher does not visit you again. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts and the suffocating silence of the castle. The forbidden hallway. Alex couldn't sleep. Mihai's warnings had seeped into his thoughts like poison, twisting into vivid, half-formed nightmares whenever he closed his eyes. The words echoed in his mind. The castle will take what it wants, and it always wants something. Restless, he lit the candle on his desk and sat staring at its flickering flame. The air in his chamber was heavy, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward. Every so often, he caught faint noises drifting through the castle. The distant creak of wood, a soft shuffle of footsteps, and, most unsettling of all, the faint sound of weeping. He told himself it was the wind, or perhaps Mihai moving about the castle. But deep down he knew better. The lure of the hallway. His thoughts kept returning to Mihai's warning earlier that day, especially the part about the forbidden hallway. During their conversation, Mihai had gestured toward a passage on the first floor, flanked by two ancient suits of armor. Stay away from there, Mihai had said, his voice low and firm. No good will come of it. Alex had pressed for an explanation, but the old man refused to elaborate, muttering something about ancient evil and locked doors for a reason. Now, sitting in his dimly lit chamber, Alex found his curiosity impossible to ignore. Mihai's cryptic warnings had only fueled his resolve. He needed to know what was hidden in the depths of Bran Castle. After a moment's hesitation, Alex stood, grabbed his flashlight, and pushed open the door to his room. The hallway outside was silent, bathed in deep shadows that seemed to move with the flickering of his light. He hesitated, listening for any sign of Mihai's presence. but the old man was nowhere to be seen. Approaching the hallway, the castle's corridors were a labyrinth of twisting passages and abrupt turns. Alex made his way carefully, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the stone walls. The air grew colder as he descended to the first floor, the faint scent of mildew and something metallic filling his nostrils. When he turned the corner, the forbidden hallway came into view. It was even more imposing than he remembered. Two rusting suits of armor flanked the entrance, their visors lowered as if in eternal vigil. The hallway beyond was narrow and dark, the stone walls covered in damp moss. At the far end, Alex could just make out a heavy iron door, its surface scarred with deep scratches. He hesitated, his flashlight beam flickering slightly. A strange sensation washed over him, a prickling on the back of his neck, as though unseen eyes were watching. He spun around, but the hallway behind him was empty. Gathering his courage, Alex stepped forward, the door and its warning. The air grew colder with every step, and Alex felt a knot of unease tightening in his chest. The weeping sound grew louder, echoing faintly off the stone walls. It wasn't constant. It came in broken sobs, as though whoever, or whatever, was crying was trying to stifle the sound. He reached the door, up close. It was even more foreboding than it had appeared from a distance. The iron surface was pitted with rust and scarred with deep grooves, as though claws had raked against it. A thick chain was wrapped tightly around the handles, secured with an ancient, heavy lock. Alex shone his flashlight on the lock, his breath catching in his throat. An engraving was etched into the metal, the letters faint but unmistakable. "Those who enter, do not leave." His mouth went dry. The words carried a weight, a sense of finality that made him hesitate. But his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He ran his fingers over the grooves in the door, wondering what could have made them. The feeling of being watched, the sense of being watched returned, stronger this time. Alex felt his skin crawl, his body tensing involuntarily. He turned his flashlight toward the suits of armor at the entrance to the hallway. For a moment, he could have sworn one of the visors had shifted, angling slightly toward him. "Stop it," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're imagining things." Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The weeping had stopped now, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. It was as if the castle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alex turned his attention back to the lock. It was ancient, its surface pitted with age, but it looked sturdy. He tugged on the chain experimentally, but it didn't budge. Frustrated, he shone his flashlight along the edges of the door, searching for a way to force it open. That was when he saw the scratches. The scratches on the door. They were faint at first, barely visible in the dim light. But as Alex moved closer, he realized they covered the entire surface of the door. Deep, jagged gouges ran vertically and diagonally, as though something had clawed at the iron in desperation. The grooves were uneven, almost frenzied, and Alex couldn't help but wonder what kind of creature could leave such marks. They didn't look like the work of any animal he knew. There was an intelligence, a purpose, to the patterns. His stomach turned as he noticed something else. The faint outline of handprints among the scratches. Human handprints. He stepped back, his breath quickening. The weeping sound returned, louder now, as if it were coming from directly behind the door. The voice in the shadows. Alex froze. The weeping wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. A woman's voice. Faint and distorted, but unmistakable. "Help me." The words were barely audible, carried on a breath of cold air that seemed to seep through the cracks in the door. Alex's rational mind told him it was impossible, that no one could be behind that door. But another part of him, deeper and more primal, believed it. He pressed his ear to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he whispered. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please help me." The desperation in the voice was palpable, and Alex felt a pang of guilt. Whoever it was, they sounded terrified, trapped. He stepped back, his hands shaking. I can't," he said, his voice trembling. The door's locked. The voice didn't answer, but the weeping continued, rising in pitch until it became a wail. Alex clapped his hands over his ears, the sound unbearable, almost inhuman. The darkness moves. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. "Damn it," Alex muttered, fumbling with the flashlight. He slapped it against his palm, but the beam refused to return. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and then he felt it, a presence behind him. He turned slowly, his body rigid with fear. The suits of armor at the entrance loomed in the faint light of his phone screen, their visors glinting ominously. But it wasn't the armor that held his attention. The shadows between them moved. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the darkness, a faint shift that could easily have been his imagination. But then it grew, the shadows coalescing into a shape, a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and wrong. Its face was obscured, but Alex could feel its eyes on him, cold and unrelenting. The voice from behind the door rose again, a piercing scream that seemed to shake the very walls of the castle. The figure in the shadows began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. Alex stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. He turned and ran, the scream echoing in his ears as he fled the forbidden hallway. Return to safety. Alex didn't stop running until he was back in his chamber, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind him. His chest heaved, his body trembling as he collapsed onto the bed. For a long time, he sat there in the dark, listening to the pounding of his own heart. The voice and the shadow figure haunted his thoughts. Their images burned into his mind. He didn't know what was behind that door, but one thing was clear. Mihai had been right. Some doors were meant to stay closed. The lurking shadow. The storm had quieted by the time night fell, leaving Bran Castle shrouded in an uneasy stillness. The rain had ceased, but the air remained damp and heavy, the kind of chill that seeped into the bones. Alex paced his room, unable to shake the events of the day. The forbidden hallway, the scratches on the door, the pleading voice. Every corner of the castle seemed to hum with a quiet menace. The air itself felt alive, like a coiled predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He glanced at his camera resting on the desk, its lens pointed toward the window. Photography had always been his way of documenting history, capturing fleeting moments that might otherwise be lost. Tonight, it felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor himself to the real world. But something about the courtyard outside drew his attention. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange compulsion to look out the window, as though the darkness itself was calling to him. The first glimpse, Alex crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. The courtyard below was bathed in faint moonlight, its cobblestones slick with rain. The twisted tree at its center cast long, skeletal shadows that seemed to writhe against the stone walls. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as he scanned the courtyard, his breath caught in his throat. A figure moved among the shadows. It was barely visible at first, a fleeting blur that seemed to shift in and out of existence. Alex narrowed his eyes, pressing his face closer to the glass. The figure became clearer, a tall, gaunt shape wrapped in a dark cloak, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost gliding rather than walking. It paused near the tree, turning its head as if searching for something. Alex's heart pounded as he realized the figure had no discernible face. Instead, its head was shrouded in shadow, a void that absorbed the moonlight. His first instinct was to recoil, to step back from the window and hide, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. He reached for his camera, fumbling to adjust the settings. Following the figure, as Alex raised the camera to his eye, the figure began to move again, crossing the courtyard with deliberate steps. It headed toward a small archway on the far side, one Alex hadn't noticed before. Determined to capture the moment, Alex snapped a photo. The shutter clicked, and the flash illuminated the courtyard for the briefest of seconds. The figure stopped. Alex froze, his finger hovering over the camera's button. The figure didn't move or turn, but he felt its attention shift, as though it were suddenly aware of him. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against his chest like a vice. The figure began to glide toward the archway, vanishing into the shadows. Without thinking, Alex grabbed his jacket and his flashlight and bolted from the room. The courtyard chase. The castle's corridors seemed longer and darker than before as Alex made his way to the courtyard. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and the cold stone beneath his feet seemed to leach the warmth from his body. When he reached the courtyard, he paused, scanning the area with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, highlighting the twisted tree and the archway beyond. The figure was nowhere to be seen. Alex stepped cautiously onto the wet cobblestones, his shoes slipping slightly on the uneven surface. The air was still unnaturally so, and every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the tree's branches, the distant drip of water, the crunch of gravel beneath his feet. He approached the archway, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, a black void that seemed to devour the light. "Hello," he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. The only response was his own echo. The red eyes. Alex hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the compulsion to press forward was stronger. He stepped beneath the archway, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The space beyond was smaller than he had expected, a tight corridor lined with crumbling stone walls. The air was colder here, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decay. As he moved further in, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Alex swung his flashlight around, the beam bouncing off the uneven walls. Then he saw them, two red lights, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were eyes, inhuman, unblinking, and filled with a cold, predatory malice. Alex's breath hitched as the figure began to emerge from the shadows, its gaunt frame bending and twisting unnaturally. He stumbled back, fumbling for his camera. His fingers trembled as he raised it and pressed the shutter. The flash went off, blinding him momentarily. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone. Examining the photo, Alex's hands shook as he reviewed the photo on the camera's tiny screen. The image was blurry, the details distorted by the dim light and his unsteady grip. But the eyes were there, two glowing red orbs staring directly at the lens. His stomach churned as he realized the figure had been closer than he thought, its outstretched hand reaching toward him. He glanced around, his flashlight darting across the corridor. But the figure was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive silence pressed down on him, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Clutching the camera tightly, Alex turned and ran back toward the courtyard. Mihai's arrival. When Alex burst into the courtyard, Mihai was waiting. The old man stood near the tree, his expression grim and unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" Mihai said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Alex nodded, struggling to catch his breath. It was in the corridor. "I got a photo." Mihai's pale eyes narrowed as Alex showed him the image. The old man studied it in silence, his face betraying no emotion. Finally, he handed the camera back. "You're a fool," Mihai said. "You shouldn't have followed it." "What is it?" Alex demanded. "What's happening in this castle?" Mihai leaned heavily on his cane, his gaze fixed on the archway. "The Watcher," he said. "It's always watching, always waiting." "For what?" Alex asked, his voice rising. Mihai didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking back toward the castle. The warning repeated. Alex hurried to catch up, his flashlight swinging wildly as they entered the castle. "Mihai, stop. I need answers. What is this thing? Why is it here?" Mihai stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "This castle is not just a place, Alex. It's a crossroads, a wound in the fabric of the world. The Watcher is its guardian, its jailer, and its prisoner. You've drawn its attention now, and that is a dangerous thing." Alex stared at him, his mind racing. "What does it want from me?" The old man's expression darkened. "Perhaps it wants you to leave, or perhaps it wants you to stay. Either way, it will take what it needs." Before Alex could respond, Mihai walked away, his cane tapping against the stone floor. Lingering fear. Back in his chamber, Alex locked the door and slid the bolt into place. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo on his camera. The red eyes seemed to glow even in the image, their malevolent gaze piercing through the screen. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the castle, every whisper of wind sent his heart racing. He kept the camera close, as though the act of holding it would keep him tethered to reality. But deep down, he knew Mihai was right. The Watcher had noticed him now, and it would not forget.